So thanks for joining us. Vocabulary is at the heart of who we are as human beings. Words represent concepts. Words such as delighted, considerable, and enjoyable convey specificity in a way that words like happy, big, and fun don't. Vocabulary and the knowledge it represents are the best predictors of how people are going to do in school and in their careers. We also know that students aren't on an even playing field when it comes to their vocabularies on entering school. Some students come to school knowing about delighted, considerable, and enjoyable, but many students don't. To move beyond happy, big, and fun, these students need strategic instruction. How can we as educators be strategic in the words that we teach students? In particular, how do we do that in light of the enormous dictionary or lexicon of English? In the Oxford English Dictionary, there are at least 280,000 root words, each of which have associated words. That's a lot of words. Fortunately, there's some new information that can guide us. The digital world has increased the demands on literacy, but it's also provided us some new ways to look at the vocabulary of student texts and also the role of different words in text. And that's the information I'm going to share with you today. In particular, I'm going to show you how a very small group of words in English, 2,500 families of words, does the heavy lifting. This group of words accounts for an average of 90% of all the words you read and all the words in school text. This vocabulary forms the foundation for proficient reading. The words in this group aren't just Dolch words, and they are not words to be memorized. Further, just because the number is relatively small doesn't mean that the task is easy. In today's presentation, you're going to learn about what's involved for students to know these words so that they have the grasp of these words that do the heavy lifting, and how teachers can foster proficiency with these words. To understand why a strategic approach is so critical, let's take a look at the way in which words in a typical vocabulary instruction in English language arts occurs. Here are all the unique words. That means the words that appear at least a single time in a story called Me and Uncle Romy, and that's been used in a couple different programs at third grade level. When I take the words out that have 5 letters or fewer, which is assuming kids can decode those, which is a big assumption, I know, but we're left with 130 words. These are words like platform, market, rooftops, that in all likelihood, students haven't seen before in text. That doesn't mean that they don't know the word chocolate or ticket or funeral. It just means that this is probably the first time they're approaching this word in text. So of these 130 words, which ones have publishers actually chosen to emphasize during a week-long of instruction? Keep remembering 130 rare words, and these are the words that have been chosen. Now, when I look at these words, I wonder why the word streak or smeared, or in the other publisher, the word flights or picture. When I look at these words, I'm not sure that I get much of an understanding about the content of the text, or in particular, why these words were chosen rather than some other ones. That's what I've been asking for the last 15 years. Why some words and not other words? In my search, I amassed a set of 10,000 student texts that are used across grades and across content areas. So I have 10,000 texts that have been digitized. I've scanned them, and I've been able to analyze them. So I have a word analyzer that looks at 12 different features of words, frequency of words, how concrete the words are, and so on. In my search for a strategic vocabulary, I was especially interested in what words account for 90% of the words in text. Why 90, you ask? Well, over a long period of time, clinicians like Mari Clay of Reading Recovery argued that if you know about 90% of the words, you should be able to comprehend a text and to use context to figure out the remaining unknown words. My analyses of these 10,000 texts showed that a group of 2,500 word families fit this criterion. A family consists, keep remembering, I'm going to always underscore that I'm talking about families of words. A family consists of the words around a root word, like around help, helpful, helping, unhelpful, helpless, helper, and so on. Sometimes I'm going to call these 2,500 word families, but I'm also going to describe them at times as the core vocabulary. Why? Because this vocabulary is truly the core of text. It counts for the majority of the words that students read. So as you can see here from my analysis of the 10,000 texts, I've established that these 2,500 word families accounted for 90% of the words. And then we've got another 10%. I call them the purple words. Incredibly large group. And those are the words that I described as rare. Those are the words that, for example, in Me and Uncle Romy, words were kind of cherry-picked from that set for an instructional purpose. Now, I wasn't just satisfied with looking at my 10,000. I asked the question, I wanted to do a validation study. So I got the 200 texts that the developers of the Common Core State Standards, remember them about 8 years ago, they identified in one of the appendices of the Common Core texts that they believe to exemplify the appropriate text at 6 different grade levels. So I took samples of all these 200 texts, in some cases the entire text, and I asked the question, how well does this vocabulary of 2,500 words account for these words in these texts? So here's what I established. I established that on average, of this million-word corpus or group of words, total words in the text, what I found was that 91%, there's that critical 90% line, I found that 91% of all the words in the text fell into the 2,500 word families. Now these numbers, because my system is a little different than the one that we're using today, but you can see that these word families don't all happen at once. We start out at grade 1 with about half of the word families, and then systematically we keep adding word families right up till college and career ready. So, and keep remembering at college and career ready, the percentage is about 89. You can see here at grade 1, it's 97. So that means that this family of words is really, really powerful. Remember that at college and career ready, there were books like Euclid's Geometry. Okay, this next slide gives you a sense of the families. So these aren't just the Dolch words. In the first 100, those are Dolch words, but with movement down the families, the words become more complex. And keep remembering that each of the words represents a family, not a single word. So when we look at the word imagine in the middle group, it represents words like imagination. And when we see assume here, it's words like assumption. What I want to ask today is, to get good at these words, what is it that students need to learn? Or if you're good at these words, what is it that you've learned about language? So again, what do the 2,500 word families mean for students' proficiencies as readers? I'm going to identify 3 things that these 2,500 word families exemplify. The first is topic knowledge. This is really critical because keep remembering, why do we read? We read to get information about the natural world, about the social world, about how people have solved problems over generations and centuries. Now, within the 2,500 word families, just about any key idea that you can think of in the natural and social world are represented there. Not comprehensive groups necessarily, but the ideas are represented there. So, by the way, the size of the circle is going to tell you the size that family contributes to the word families. So a big topic is health in the human body. Another one, a set of words that appear both in social studies and science and also in stories, has to do with places and dwellings. So in social studies, you might hear about markets, and in stories, characters might go to a market. Another critical group are animals. We've got jobs, very large and important group, machines, and then we've got about another 15 topics. So what I'm saying is, learning the 2,500 morphological families isn't just learning a group of words. It's learning about some central ideas that are going to provide the foundation for the learning and reading you do for the rest of your career. So these ideas are pretty comprehensive of the ideas we have as human beings. Okay, so the first thing about the 2,500 words is it's not just a list to memorize. In fact, it isn't a list to memorize. It's a group of words that are topically connected. And remember, background knowledge is the best predictor of how well you're going to comprehend. So these words are helping you get a real anchor. It's helping you get roots into the content areas that really form the basis for our ideas. The second idea, if I form those groups on the basis of root words or morphology, then it makes sense that these knowledge of these words also represents morphological knowledge. So each of the words in the 2,500 word families has about an average of 7 members. There's some words like the that are loners, and then there are other words that have a lot more members. But to get good at the 2,500 words, to get good at reading, it's not just decoding you do need that, but morphology is going to be incredibly important. What's really important to know about English is that English is an unusual language because, unlike other languages, English has 2 major language sources. Most languages just have one language source. And for every language source, there's a different way in which morphological families work. So what I'm talking about here is to get good at the 2,500 families, you're needing to develop not memorization of these facts about morphological families, but you're needing to develop a sense of how families are made. So at the bottom of the pyramid are words that came from this initial source of English, which was Anglo-Saxon, which is a Germanic form of language. And in Anglo-Saxon, we have fairly short words usually that are down to earth, and new words in the Anglo-Saxon. We make inflected endings and plurals, but if we're creating a new word, we do it through compound words. And in the compound words, it turns out that the meanings, usually you can extract what the meaning is, especially if you're a native English speaker, but sometimes the meanings can be a little bit idiosyncratic. So if you're trying to teach words in families with compounds, it can get a little dicey sometimes. Okay, so a cornfield is a place where corn is grown, and a battlefield is a place where battles are fought. But an airfield isn't a field of just air. Okay, it applies to flying in the air, and that's something that needs to be understood. Excuse me for a minute. The second contribution to English, so at a particular time in English history, right at the end of the Middle Ages, the Normans who spoke French invade England, and they ruled for 300 years. And during that period of time, it turns out that the working class people continue to speak Anglo-Saxon. So we've got lots of words around things like woods and farms, words like cows and pigs. Those are Anglo-Saxon. And during the same period of time, the people in charge, so the aristocracy, the clergy, they spoke French. And French operates in a very different way than Anglo-Saxon does. In French, you make phrases, but you don't make compounds in the same kind of way you do in Anglo-Saxon. What you do is you have derivatives that you make with prefixes and suffixes. Words like separate, inseparable, separation, and so on. I just want to caution you that all the words I'm showing here are actually words that are in the 2500 families. Now, I started out by saying that there are two primary sources of different languages in English. And there's a third source. And this source is actually across many different languages. I should comment here that what happened when French no longer was the prominent language of Great Britain is that they couldn't, the loan words were there, the L-O-A-N words, okay, words like separate rather than break apart, which might be the Anglo-Saxon equivalent. Okay, so we've got a lot of words, and it turns out because of this grounding of the Romance in the more erudite part of society, it turns out that this is where a lot of the literary and academic words come from. But a third source that is pretty generic or shared across languages are Greek and Latin words. And that system has yet another way of making new words. This time it's compounding, but unlike the Anglo-Saxon layer, these words are equivalent in the contribution that they make to the new word, and the meanings don't change over time. Okay, so to become good at knowing the 2500 words, I'm not suggesting you have to be able to say, oh, that word fits in here, or this word fits in there. Although this triangle or pyramid can be a very useful thing to share with students. Okay, this is a way in which we can do some explicit or intentional instruction. We can actually show them about these different language sources. They can collect words that they can, put on a word wall that are attached to these different layers of English. So this is the second dimension of what you learn when you're learning the 2500 words. The final thing is to get good with the 2500 word families, you've got to have a sense that many words have a number of different meanings. From the get-go, so some of the most basic words kids read when they're starting in reading, words like bat and can and bear, have multiple meanings. So students need to learn about or have the anticipation. I call it linguistic flexibility. You have to be ready for words having different meaning. And here's an example of what I mean by multiple meanings. So a triangle is a shape, but we also use the term getting in better shape, talking about our human shape in this case. And then sometimes we use the idea metaphorically. An idea took shape. Okay, so What I want to stress today, and this is actually something that really became evident as I analyzed the 2,500 morphological families. One of the things that's really interesting is that the level of different meanings words have to do with the commonality of words. So let's just jump back to that pyramid for a minute. So the Anglo-Saxon words that form the base of the pyramid here, they're the most common words. And it turns out that one of the reasons they're so frequent is because they have so many uses. So for example, a word like field has some very unique uses, and we also see here in the fourth example that's enlarged a little bit, that there's a scientific use. And we know from research that when students know a word in a common language and they encounter it in a more technical way, there can be some interference. So I'm pointing out here that if you think of if you have a rigid sense of the word field, and you learn about somebody talking about somebody entering the medical field, and you think of it like a field of wheat or hay, that's going to be hard for you in terms of your comprehension. Some of these meanings seem to be close, at least to us as adults or native English speakers, but they actually start, some of them can morph quite a bit. So here we've got field as a verb, and we see that he fielded the ball. Well, it turns out, why do we use that word that way? Well, the history shows us that, they were playing on a field and people started talking about fielding the ball. But you also see that we have some more metaphorical meanings, and some of the meanings, like the use of the word in the adjective form, can be fairly rare, but some of the other ones can be fairly frequent. So working with kids, teaching kids, that we can anticipate words to have different meanings. And it's not just about words like there, and there. It is most words. I think I said, and if I didn't, I need to make sure I say this, on average, the words in the 2,500 core families have 7 meanings. I said 7 morphological members and 7 meanings in terms of the polysemous or multiple meaning part of the language. Okay, here we see the word from the Romance part. And what we're seeing is the meanings are fewer. And in fact, all of these meanings of separate or separate have some commonality. Okay, so we don't have quite as much morphing typically in this level of language, in this layer of language, as we do in the Anglo-Saxon one. This word I chose intentionally because it's an example of a word that with different parts of speech actually has a different pronunciation. So it's a homograph. And finally, here's an example from the Greek Latin layer. And at this level, when words have a very technical meaning, typically there isn't as much morphing in the meaning. So we see the noun and the verb forms. And keep remembering, words in English do a lot of this. They move from being a noun to a verb and so on. That requires flexibility as well. But what you're seeing here is that the verb form of this word is actually just making into action the meaning of the noun. So it has a very close meaning. So in summary for this section, let me go back here. What I've said is, to get good at the 2,500 word families, or what is it that you're learning with the 2,500 word families, it's about topic knowledge, it's about morphological sense, and it's also having a flexibility with the meanings of words, which is why you have to do a lot of monitoring, especially when there are a lot of common words. And when does that happen the most? At the early levels of reading. So we start working on multiple meanings from the get-go. Now I want to ask, what do the 2,500 word families mean for instruction? These ideas are really important ones that I've described. This group of words is incredibly powerful. It's not a tiny group, right, with 7 members each. That means that there are about 11,000 words. Some of them are pretty straightforward, the inflected endings, the plurals, the possessives, and so on. In some cases, with the compound words, it's a little bit more distal, but there's a family connection with these words. So what I want to say is there are 3 dimensions to getting good at the 2,500 word families. The first is you've got to read extensively. And some of you who have heard me before, have read some of my work, know that this is a primary theme in my work. If you don't do a lot of reading, it's going to be really hard to get good at reading. And this is a form of reading that I call responsible reading, where the student is reading a text. That doesn't mean teachers don't do read aloud of outstanding books, but I'm talking about books that the state or your district has purchased for the purpose of getting kids better at reading. Kids need to be doing extensive amounts of reading. What I want to share with you is texts in a typical literacy program. And what you see here is, especially as we move to having more informational text, what we see here is lots of interesting titles, but there's nothing that connects the texts together in terms of knowledge. And that's going to be hard to teach those concepts in the 2,500 core families, right? Because for every text, you're going to be jumping around. There are going to be some words in common, of course, like the and is and of and so on. But you're going to be jumping around from every group. In one group, you're going to be talking about soccer. You're going to be talking about trolls. You're going to be talking about underground. Another text about smell. And kids aren't going to get the development of the content, the topic knowledge, nor are they going to have the repetition of words that's really critical to developing proficiency in reading. Here's a contrast where we have a knowledge program where sets of texts have been created to emphasize the same vocabulary. In one form, pretty as a picture, it's an informational text, and then you'll have a narrative text that uses some of the same words. What's happening here is you're developing background knowledge. You're developing that foundation of the 2,500 families. Now, one of the things I did is I took 11,500 words at second grade. Second grade's a really important level in terms of getting good at the 2,500 families. I took 11,500 words from this typical program and from the knowledge-based program. And I analyzed them to look at the appearance of the word families within a really critical band, not among the most frequent words in English, but words that are really the growing edge of the core vocabulary. And what you can see here is that there are fewer word families, and most particularly, there are fewer family members that represent, there's only a single member of a family in lots of cases. One of the ways that the knowledge program actually accomplishes the goal of getting more knowledge in, and also more morphological knowledge, is by having fewer rare words. Okay? So what I'm going to suggest here, and if you'll just give me a moment, I'm going to drink some water. I apologize. We've had a series of fires in my town over the past week, and I happen to have a very bad case of asthma. So whenever that happens, I experience some asthma difficulties, and I apologize for what that does for my voice. Now, so here we've got the typical program on the left-hand side and the knowledge program on the right. And what I'm saying is that in typical programs, the words are going to appear but spread out over text. And what teachers need to do is actually do some clustering for kids. So if you're working within one of these programs, what you need to do, I'm really suggesting these semantic maps are a good idea. So around important ideas, you want to, like people, context, health, machines, some of those categories that I showed you early on. What you want to do is have kids collect the words, have discussions about these words. Also talk about and show examples of when these words can take on some different meanings. Now, in the knowledge program, some of the work has been done for you. And what you're seeing here is that there's a more systematic effort to get a lot of the words in there. But it's not that in a typical program the words aren't there. They just are going to require more vigilance on the part of teachers to actually be collecting the words. And this is another example with places. So similarly, they're always going to be names of places and stories and also informational text. But you as a teacher are wanting to help kids collect those words, okay? Versus in the knowledge program, some of that work has already been done for you. Okay, so the second point that I'm going to make is that first thing was extensive reading and awareness of the content of those texts. So what I've been saying is you actually have to do some focusing on when the core vocabulary shows up and distinguish it from some of the words that are highly unusual or rare. The second point is we want to do lessons. And I'm going to go back to me and Uncle Romy and show you that there are some different ways in which the words can be organized. And we can cover more words. Remember in those two programs I showed you, one program had, I think, 10 words or 11, the other had 8, and they were just all over the map. What I'm showing you here is it turns out that this author used an enormous number of compound words. So we don't have to distinguish this by Greek, Romance, and Anglo-Saxon, but what I have done that for the purposes of this presentation. But what you see here is that this is a great example to help kids not only understand something about the story, because a lot of these words have to do with the experiences James, the young boy who comes to visit Uncle Romy, has during his visit. But you're also teaching students something about how words work. And you're covering many more words in a more systematic, disciplined way. Another potential way you might do that is by identifying names of places. We've got common names and we've got proper names. Now the proper names are a really interesting question because it turns out that about 2 or 3 words of every 100 kids read are proper names. And we do very little instruction of proper names. Is it important to call these out? They are. It is, because it turns out that proper names typically don't occur in morphological families. Now, the word station is part of Penn Station. That is part of a family. And Liberty and Statue are parts of family. But a word like Chicago isn't in a morphological family, at least in English. Okay, so this gives you some example, and it shows you how very different an approach is when you're attending to the underlying knowledge. And there can be lots of directions you can take. But what you want to do is teach kids something about what's happening in the story. And you're teaching them something about the knowledge that's important to retain, and also about how words work. The final point that I'm going to make, and I think this is, if I had to recommend a small change that you can take from this conversation today, I think this is the one. We need to talk with kids about the fact that it's not serendipitous what they can expect when they pick up a book. There are going to be some words that are there and that they know about. And we need to be explicit that we're teaching them about these 2,500 words, 2,500 word families. We want to have explicit conversations so that students know what to expect when they approach a text. In talking to teachers, I found out that there's a wild range of what teachers think is common from grade 1 to grade 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. The point is, there are certain families, and remember that we keep adding on to some of those families over the grades, but we need to let our kids know that they are learning the majority of the words, and they can use their context clues to figure out the remainder words. So here is an example. I picked out 100 words from 3 different texts, and I'm proposing that we show kids samples of text, and I've got some available at my website, and I'm going to share that with you in just a minute. But we want to show kids that most of these words we've had experience with, and now you can actually use your knowledge of decoding and context to figure out the unknown words. Okay? That's a very different approach for kids, many of whom, especially struggling readers, think that all the words are going to be different in every text. In talking to teachers, some thought that only about 50% of the words were shared from text to text. Well, that's just not the case. About 90% are shared. And once you know those words, you can use context to figure out some of the unknown words. Oh, and look here, names. Names are really prominent, especially in stories. In informational text, sometimes names begin taking on are part of the content, but in stories, we'll see lots of proper names. In this grade 3 example, in fact, all of the words are from the 2,500 morphological families. So, and some of these words are going to be new for kids. The purpose of the book in this case is to teach them about agriculture and technology. But it's important to put the context of those new words that they're learning within the overall bigger context of all the words in text. And finally, here you get an idea of the 5th grade text, where we have a few more. The percentage is going up a little bit. Remember, the percentage of the 2,500 word families was much higher at 1st grade than it was at middle school and high school and so on. But again, especially for kids who haven't had a lot of experience as readers in their communities, knowing that there's this consistency, knowing that this is what you're building. Often I'm hearing teachers using texts that are presumed to be much easier because they've been leveled at a lower lexile. And in fact, lexiles are an indicator of sentence length. And any text at 5th grade level, even if it has a fairly low lexile, is going to have some words kids haven't encountered before. So they need to be ready for attending to new vocabulary. So in summary, what I've said is, how do you get good at the 2,500 words? You read a lot of text. Some texts are better than others. But if you don't have specialized texts, what you can do is keep your eye out for core vocabulary and make it fit into topics. Okay? I would highly recommend to teachers that if you're using level text programs, that within a particular grade band, you actually sort the books by topic, because it turns out the differences between an E and an F and a G is not that extensive. It's the topical knowledge with the shared words that make the difference. I've also talked about lessons, where we're actually making some of these patterns among the words explicit. And finally, I've said having conversations with kids is just really, really critical. They need to know this information that you know. Often we've been very secretive about how language works. We're not secretive in mathematics. You know, we don't expect our kids to do story problems before we've taught them any arithmetic or subtraction or multiplication. But in reading, we don't teach a lot about the underlying systems of language. before we actually ask kids to read text. And I'm not talking about front loading the content of a specific text. I'm talking about how words work in general, how this group of 2,500 word families gives you a lot of power as a reader. Finally, I want to take you to Text Project. Remember, my website is an open access website. That means everything here is free. The materials that I've been talking about today are under classroom materials. And there you're going to find approximately 400 texts that have been written to emphasize the 2,500 words. And they're not Dick and Jane-like texts, the Dick and Jane who are celebrated behind me. They're texts that are engaging and communicate information about core topics. Also, in the classroom materials are word pictures. Here's where those, right now we've got 15 of the 20 topics in the word pictures, which means, for example, here's machines and tools. And what you have in that section are pictures of about 40 words that are in the core vocabulary around machines and tools. Okay, so altogether I'd say about 800 pictures here of words in the core vocabulary. And finally, if you want to learn more about what I've been talking about, go to our YouTube site, and we've got about 10 videos. Some of them, they vary in length. Some of them are very, very short, and some of them are longer. But that can give you some more background on the ideas that I've been talking about. And finally, I invite you to join our Text Project community. We send out a newsletter monthly, and in that newsletter, we also have some incredibly great contests. This past fall, we gave away, I think it was 20 subscriptions to a database program, so kids and their parents and you can record the books that they're reading. So there are lots of different kinds of opportunities there, and I invite you to join us. So I thank you. I'm sorry we started out a little rusty, and my facility here with the clicker wasn't great. Apologize also for my rusty throat. But Joelle, it's up to you. Thank you very much for your attendance.
That's great. Thank you so much. That was so informative. And I also, on that note, want to share a very special offer for the Scholastic Word program that was mentioned throughout. Word exposes students to what Dr. Hebert was speaking about with the 2,500 word families, and in context with the 10 topics organized for grades K to 5. So there is this special offer that we have, and I'll include those links in the chat.